On this episode of the Futures in Digital Learning podcast, we are joined by Dr. Tom Tobin to discuss technology mediation in education. Join us as we talk about the blurring of what constitutes a learning space, reducing cognitive load for students and faculty, and the importance of digital literacy skills. Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 2 of the Futures in Digital Learning podcast. I am Adam Davey, an Instructional Design Manager at UCAT at the University of Arizona, joined once again by my co-host, Brian Hale. Brian, hello.
Hey, Adam, how you doing?
Good. How you doing today?
Excellent.
Excellent. And we are very excited today to welcome Dr. Tom Tobin to the podcast. He helped found the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Mentoring at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an internationally recognized scholar, author, and speaker on technology-mediated education. We are very excited to welcome him today and talk about some cool things on the topic of technology within education. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Adam and Brian. It's great to be on the show, and hello, listeners.
All right. So we will just kind of jump right in and, speaking about technology and ask, how has technology changed what constitutes a learning space?
I'm kind of approaching our conversation through an observation and evaluation lens. Two co-authors and I wrote a book in 2015 called Evaluating Online Teaching. Our research and advice covered the range of what was then possible online instructional scenarios. So what we might nowadays call traditional online spaces like learning management system or LMS shells, those afforded a highly mediated and structured range of possible interactions among the instructors, the learners, and the tool sets within those spaces. Those were largely asynchronous, and online teaching left a clear trail of observable phenomena. So announcement posts, discussion threads, comments on student work, they were all captured in the LMS space. And back in 2015, we worried that such a cornucopia of observable data points would lead people to analysis paralysis. We advised observers of online teaching to limit their observations to just one unit or one online session, like an on-ground observer might observe only one or two class periods of live class time. Well, that's all changed. We're now in an instructional world where the bounded environment of the LMS seems almost simple, especially as a result of the emergency remote instruction during the COVID-19 pandemic. The possible permutations and definitions of online teaching, they've exploded. So what's a learning space? For those of us tasked with observing, evaluating, crediting, critiquing the teaching that happens at our institutions, we can't assume any longer that looking in one place, whether that's a classroom physically, an LMS shell, a Zoom recording of a live remote session, we can't assume that looking in one place will afford us a representative sample of the teaching practices and behaviors that instructors exhibit. Because even in nominally in-person learning situations, technology mediation is now routine, pervasive, it's perhaps inescapable. So what's a learning space? It's everywhere now.
And that's a good point, right? There's that even in-person courses, technology is prevalent.
Oh, yeah.
And not just, it used to be where in-person courses didn't even need an LMS shell. They would hand out physical copies of the syllabus. They would, do everything in that, live space. But now they have those spaces too, and students are doing work outside of that in-person course within the LMS, almost as if it is a hybrid course at times, right?
Absolutely. And even in courses that are nominally face-to-face, somebody who is pure chalk and talk is a complete rarity these days.
Right.
What we have in our pockets, our mobile phones, mean that students, when they are away from the formal spaces, places, and times of our classrooms or our online environments or whatever it is, that's when a lot of the learning is happening. They're on their own. They're trying to study. They're trying to read, prepare, get ready, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so how, what sort of changes have you seen or shifts with that technology integration? What has kind of been the good, the bad, the ugly with that per se?
Good. Yeah, it's a good question. Nearly everybody now has taught using technology mediation of some kind, right? The universe of possible modalities, tools, loci of interaction, those have expanded significantly.
Yeah.
Now, things were never 100% chalk and talk for most of us, even before the pandemic shift to emergency remote instruction. And observing teaching, whether it was tech mediated or not, that's always been a challenge. Taking notes during a single 60-minute class lecture session, that prevents observers from seeing patterns among class sessions or seeing office hour or after class support discussions that instructors might have. And bringing technology mediated communications like email messages and phone calls into the evaluation. In traditional online teaching, observers have to set aside similarly opaque teaching instances, either because there's just a sheer volume of observable data that you'd have to select from, or because some teaching behaviors take place beyond the space and time of the observation. So, email messages that explain concepts and answer questions, or individual live remote calls, or grading feedback that's captured in the LMS, but observers maybe
Hmm.
can't see it. So
Yeah.
we knew back in the day how to observe and evaluate this sort of teaching. The set aside interactions for on ground and traditional asynchronous online teaching, they were almost wholly idiosyncratic. They were really situation dependent. They were hard to measure, they're hard to categorize, they're hard to quantify. So we focused on things that were replicable and quantifiable in the teaching behaviors as key measures of what we called quality teaching. We learn to separate the evaluation of the design elements of online courses, the content that's in there before interactions begin, from the teaching behaviors that were exhibited by instructors. That's the regular and substantive interactions that are inherent in the
Yeah.
definition from the US Department of Education.
Right.
Now, in traditional asynchronous online teaching, I can't believe I have to say traditional about this now,
Right.
but it's been 25 years. Uh, the key indicators of quality were the level, frequency, and depth of interaction, engagement, and then guidance of the learners. This was things like announcements, discussion posts, commentary,
Mhm.
and various media in response to student questions, activities, or their concerns. So when we would observe traditional online teaching, it was largely free of that observer effect where your presence changes the behaviors of instructors and students. Oh, don't mind me. I'm just sitting here in the back of the classroom. Pay no attention to the guy taking notes,
Yeah.
right? Because observation for online asynchronous could take place after the interactions themselves took place. The teaching interactions under observation took the form of text-based or media evidence, and observers would have access in the LMS. So we could
Mhm.
evaluate those online teaching behaviors using measurable, repeatable, and consistent criteria. There's been a big shift, though. Listeners, today, the sorts of teaching interactions that we previously set aside as unobservable, they might be themselves the majority of the interactions that instructors have with their online, technology mediated, or even their face to face learners. So while LMS data remain the largest category of observable traces of tech mediated teaching, we can't assume that they are representative or even primary sources of information about the teaching that's happening in those spaces. So let me walk you through three recent
Yeah.
changes that allowed instruction to kind of break out of its classroom and LMS box. First, inexpensive telepresence. Second, the shift to emergency live remote instruction. And then we talked about it a second ago. The third one is the establishment of that new definition of regular and substantive interaction from the US Department of Ed. So, first off, inexpensive telepresence. Since 2018, and especially during those lockdown years of the COVID-19 pandemic, reliable, simple, inexpensive live telepresence is within reach of most people in North America and Europe. So beginning with like live whiteboarding applications like Blackboard
Mhm.
Collaborate, and now culminating in the near universal adoption of that category killer app Zoom across remote teaching spaces, The two-way wrist communicator from the old Dick Tracy comics, it's finally here for a large enough segment of the public that during the pandemic, live video teaching sessions became the de facto replacement for on-ground in-person sessions, rather than asynchronous LMS-based online teaching. So that's inexpensive telepresence. Everybody's got a video player
Yeah.
and a camera in their pocket. Now, that ready availability of synchronous live remote tools led in turn to the fracturing and fragmentation of teaching itself into spaces that are not all curated or easily accessible by peer and administrative observers. When's the last time you worked with a colleague who said, "Oh, yeah, I'm doing all my stuff on Discord," but your university doesn't actually have a Discord server or
Right.
support it, right?
Yeah.
So the pandemic saw an expansion of the number of instructors using tech mediation just to continue teaching. Instead of a small self-selected group of tech-savvy instructors using online tools to teach, in early 2020, almost everyone have to shift quickly to live remote and out of necessity, good enough replacements, right?
Right.
Worldwide, there was a significant drop in the number of technology-mediated teaching interactions used for the awarding of tenure, promotion, reemployment
Mhm.
during that pandemic lockdown. Administrators who were unsure about how to observe or assess teaching quality in those new or unfamiliar modalities, they just went back to the safety of observing data-rich environments, or they skipped observations altogether under emergency practices. So into this confusion, here's that third part. The US Department of Education clarified its criteria for quality in distance education programs. And that was kind of a belated wake up call for a lot of us. The new criteria for 2021 defined a minimum for levels of interactivity in distance education course offerings, requiring that tech mediated teaching be A, instructor initiated, B, regular and frequent, C, academically substantive, and D, it had to engage at least along 3 lines of practice among direct instruction, assessment and feedback, providing course information, group discussion, and they had a catch-all sort of other category there. With these updated definitions and criteria, observers of online teaching, now we have clearer baseline focus areas against which we can distinguish met or not met yet criteria. So how have instructors integrated tech across all modalities? They've gone to the 4 winds. It really exploded and fragmented a lot.
And you bring up a lot of interesting points, and one of the things I kind of want to go back to is, how instructors are communicating with students in a
Mm,
variety of ways. Whether we have announcement posts, we have discussion boards. You mentioned, feedback on graded assignments, through email, all these different ways, right? And how
mhm,
how that is, and even video posts, right, or through live, the telepresence, if they're having live sessions, or recording a session and putting it for students, all these different things, to ways to navigate, um but ultimately, kind of what I'm interested in is how are students receiving these messages, or are they? And how do instructors kind of navigate, like, what is the best way to communicate? And what makes me think of this is that, I just finished teaching an online asynchronous course where, when we want to get messages to students for whatever reason, whether positive or offering some criticism, things like that, we can put feedback in there, but there's no guarantee that the students are actually opening that feedback to see it, right? We can send them an email. There's no guarantee that the email is going to get read. Um, we also have a program through Trellis, which offers a way to send targeted emails to students, and those messages also go to the students' advisors, and I don't know who else
mm.
gets that. Whoever's protected under FERPA, I'm sure, but but uh, it's, so those things create a record of sort as well, which then offers kind of, a backup for instructors, like, well, I put it there. It's not my fault that, they didn't see it. Like, it's
Ah,
there. So I just wonder, though, like, what. as an instructor, like how do you navigate all of that? And we're going to get into kind of talking about the cognitive load of students with navigating all of this, but just kind of listening to thinking about all of these things where, you know, the technology integration has occurred. You know, what about that cognitive load for instructors and managing the communication
Mm.
uh, via technology, and how, you know, is there a way to do that, or have you seen kind of that overload in instructors that you've worked with or talked with?
Adam, you've just asked the let's depress the listeners
Right, yeah.
question. So listeners, hang on for just a second because let's unpack that question.
Right.
I hear two questions in there. One
Yeah.
of them is how do we reach students where they are and how do we
Hmm.
know where they are
Right.
technology wise?
Right.
And then a secondary question inside that is how do we manage the communication channels that we have available to us and how do we say we're going to use these but not those?
Right.
So let's unpack both of those. One, now the depress the listener portion of your conversation. Listeners, here are some depressing statistics. If you post an announcement into your learning management system course, take a second and think, how long will it be before 80% of your students read that message? Adam, Brian, any guesses
uh
on that one?
80%, I would say at least 4 weeks.
Oh, you're more generous than I am.
Yeah.
Well, there is the anchoring effect. So now Brian's
Yeah.
going to start
Right.
thinking more in terms of weeks instead of days. What was your guess on
Yeah.
that one, Brian?
I was going to say they may not see it at all, depending on the learning management system they're using, because some learning management systems, when you exit out of it, when you go back into it, it takes you back to the place where you left, not necessarily the announcement page. So
Mhm.
they
It's
have
true.
to uh, manually click over to view that announcement. So there are some students that may not see it at all.
Gold star for Brian. And that's
Yeah.
why I asked the question in terms of how long until 80% of your students open it. The fail to open rate in learning management systems runs about 15%. Like 15% of your learners will never
Yeah.
actually see it. And then when we get to that 80%, Adam said 4 weeks, the stats, and we've got this from a recent study from EDUCAUSE. The stats show us that on average, to get to 80% of your students, it takes about 2.5 weeks. So not as dire as Adam was guessing, but
Yeah.
he's in the right ballpark though.
Yeah.
Now, if you send an email to your students.edu official university or college email address, how long before 80% of them open the email? I won't keep you in suspense on this one. 7 days. It usually
Okay.
takes a week before 80% of your folks open it. And again, the never open rate hovers between 15 and
Yeah.
20%.
Yeah.
If you, by some miracle, have your students' cell phone numbers
Hmm.
and you send your students a text message, how long before 80% of your students have read that text message?
23 seconds.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's remarkably specific.
Yeah.
Yep. As if we were playing
I-
The Price is Right or some other TV game show, you'd be well prepared. The
yeah.
answer is literally seconds.
Yeah.
It's on the order of 10 to 15 seconds. If your phone dings in your pocket, you think, "Oh, I have a message." Up, open it.
Hmm.
So we are dopamine addled humans, and it's not just our students, it's us in design and teaching as well. But when we think about where we post our messages and how to reach students where they are, one of the most effective ways that we can do that in a tech mediated world is to provide signposts and to choose which messages move fast and which messages move slowly. So, what I've seen a lot of instructors do is they give information about due dates, about study help, and then about feedback being available in the fastest possible means that they can. So I've seen a number of instructors use a service like remind.com. I'm not here to advertise anything, but it's one kind of service where for free, you sign up, you say, I'm teaching Marketing 300, and it makes a Marketing 300 page. You, instructor, give it your your cell phone number, and your students go and they don't see your number. They put in their cell phone numbers.
Mhm.
Nobody sees each other's information.
Yeah.
And then you log into remind.com to send out a quick text
Mhm.
message that goes out on demand to everybody.
Mhm.
You can oversaturate your students with text messages. And then, oh, it's another, thing from Professor Hale or Professor Davy. Never mind. I'll just look at that later.
Yeah.
So choosing which messages need to go fast. There's a deadline coming up. Here's help for studying, or hey, my feedback is ready for you. Those pull people into a learning management system or other environment so that they can check the announcement, so that they can read your feedback, so that they can go into the grades tool, or go to your Discord server and hear your audio feedback, right? Whichever technologies you would prefer to use or where you've put your information, that doesn't necessarily comport with where the communication is happening. That's actually also a big challenge for assessment, observation, and evaluation, because those are teaching behaviors. Hey, here's a reminder. You're doing sort of housekeeping or helping people understand the workflow or process of the teaching that you're doing. And those are things that if you're being observed, you probably want to tell the observer, hey, I send out these text messages on a regular basis, and here's a copy of some of them, or something along those lines. The second part, Adam, of your question is also an interesting one. The first part was how do we know where the students are and how do we reach
Yeah.
them? But then the second decision is a much knottier one where we as instructors and designers are choosing which tools we want to put out front.
Yeah.
And one of the big balances that we have to accomplish is between academic freedom and predictability in systems. We all have academic freedom to design our learning experiences in the way we feel best and then to teach them in the way that we feel best works. We also owe it to our students to make them not have to relearn a system every time they take a new course.
Mhm.
So,
That
for
is,
example,
that is, I'm going to interrupt you. Could you say that again? Because that is so important.
once more for the people in the back,
Yeah.
we have the academic freedom to design and teach the way we feel is best, and we owe it to our students to reduce their cognitive load by designing systems that are predictable and work in similar ways when they go from one environment to the next. And I'm thinking here of the University of Cincinnati, where they started a pilot project by thinking, in our learning management system and on our website, and then in our tuition system and in our advising system, all the buttons have the same colors, and we're following the sort of marketing uh, identity manual for the
Mhm.
university, but they don't all say the same thing. Like one says go, and one says enter, and one says press, and they all do the same thing. So what they did was a federated audit of all of their systems, and they said, all right, in the learning management system, if Brian, his class is set up by week, and Adam's class is set up by unit, and Tom's class
Mhm.
is set up by module, that's confusing for students.
Mhm.
So we're going to give everybody a default structure for learning management system shells. Does that mean that everyone must use it? No, you have the academic freedom. You could change
Right.
the default structure as you like, but there is power in default settings.
Mhm.
If we give you a default setting and it's already set up for you, chances are you'll say, yeah, I can put my stuff in there,
Mhm.
and things will just fall into place.
Yeah.
And the people who really do want to teach differently or really have a meaningful reason for adopting a different structure, then they're going to ask their students to adopt those different structures along with them. Um, it, 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 it- this gets me thinking about how we apply technology to actually mediate teaching and learning
Yeah.
across modalities.
Yeah.
Like we're all collectively bad at reorganizing how we approach the time that we ask our students to put into our courses. So if we're
Mhm.
in a traditional like 3 credit course in a 15-week term, that's 3 contact hours every week in the classroom or
Right.
in the LMS. And then there's also up to 3 hours of preparing, reading, practicing, individual
Right.
and group activities, assignments, all the tasks that fall under the broad umbrella of what we call homework.
Right.
That's that traditional Carnegie classification definition of a 3-hour course. Okay, so here's how not to apply technology as a space for learning or a mediating tool. Just keep adding to our already packed courses.
Yeah.
Instructional designers who are listening, you already know the grief that I'm about to share, right? Students not all participating in the class discussions, add a weekly discussion forum into the LMS. Students not doing the pre-class work, add take-home activities and a reading quiz, right? We're really good at adding more and more and more actions for learners to take. And the technology mediated spaces don't require us as instructors to be present for or even monitor those actions. So they're mentally frictionless for us. But those 3 hours of beyond class effort end up being a parking lot for a ton of tech hosted activities that just end up becoming box checking and busy work.
Yeah.
So instructors can say, oh, yes, the learners did that.
Mhm.
Now, there's a better way to incorporate technology, whether we're teaching fully classroom based courses, online, asynchronous, or anything in between. First, identify how much time we want the learners to use, and then create interleaved cyclical progressions within that time, regardless of the modality that we're teaching in. So, listeners, you might want to check out the Wake Forest University Course Workload Estimator. You can put a link to that in the show notes, I
Yeah.
hope. This tool allows you to enter all the activities you currently ask learners to do throughout a course. It takes a while to collect and enter all those bits and pieces associated with your course, but the estimator is really consistent and it can show you where you're over or under loading your learners on a week to week basis. And then from that starting point, you follow a cycle of pre practice with incomplete information, reviewing known concepts, encountering new stuff, practice and collaboration that incorporates the new information, and then reflection and review with a focus on cementing those new concepts into existing knowledge. And each of those phases in the cycle can happen before, during, or after those formal meeting times for your course. And technology can be the place where it happens, the tool that helps learners do the actions, or it can be the way they check their progress and knowledge. And you'll notice I'm not recommending specific tools here. It's more important to understand that learning cycle and then balance all the workloads than it is to incorporate specific technologies at specific points in the cycle.
Well, and that's a good point too, because sometimes it's easy to get distracted by the bells and whistles of a fancy new technology, a new tool and stuff, and it may look cool. I know I fall into this trap sometimes where I'm like, oh, this is cool, this is exciting, I want to use it. But does it actually meet the needs of my course and my learners? And so sometimes, yeah, simple is best, right? Whatever is already in the LMS might be the best option for what you need to use,
Mm.
and what you need to to introduce to students. And it provides that consistency as well, right? Like what um like you mentioned before, if we don't have to teach it something new to the students and they're already used to it and have used it before, that's they're going to be able to jump in a little bit more easily.
Yeah, preach. Listeners, you can't see it. I'm just nodding vigorously
Yeah.
over here.
um but it's and thank you for sharing that estimator. That sounds pretty cool. I'm kind of excited to use that and check that out as well.
Mm.
um and you talked about kind of this divide between academic freedom and providing kind of a more structure, and we're we kind of struggle with that as well with our nav bar within our LMS. And what do we make just one nav bar that everybody has to use, it's
Mhm.
consistent for students, or do we give people the freedom to choose what they put in there? And student surveys have given us pretty emphatic data that says no, they'd like it to be consistent. They don't want to search for things in different places in different courses. And so it's interesting that we still have this uh, debate or this conversation of like, well, what should we do when students
Mm.
are pretty clearly telling us in every survey, like, this is what we want and need.
I kind of liken it to the Starbucks effect. No matter where you go in the world, when you go into a Starbucks, you know you're in a Starbucks because it's kind of all laid out the
Yeah.
same. But the difference is every person's experience in a Starbucks is different because you may just pop in for your morning latte and then leave. You may take your laptop in and do some work. Your experience in that Starbucks is what you make of it. And by having everything sort of, well, templated out for you,
Mhm.
your students can go into the course. They don't have to spend time searching for anything, and they can do what they need to do to be successful in your course rather than increase their mental workload of trying to find things and figure out how this instructor's brain has categorized everything in the course. They just have a much easier time. And the students have told us this is what is easy for us. Please,
Yeah.
please don't do anything else. This is we're telling you, you know.
Well, and Brian, it's not just student preferences. We've got large studies that talk about cognitive load.
Yeah.
As human beings, we have only so much processing power at any given time. And if we're spending part of that deciphering the structures or systems, then we actually have less power available to then turn around and say, oh, now I need to think about macroeconomics,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So, like, students have to expend a lot of energy and time relearning technology systems and
Mhm.
interfaces that if they're being used in different ways by different people.
Right.
So if I structure those top level buttons and folders in my LMS course by topic, you go by week, we're both nominally teaching similar courses, but learners have to encounter and adapt to our own idiosyncratic structures every time they start a new course. So that's a misplaced cognitive load. We have to balance the competing interests of academic freedom against access and predictability. And here's an irony, right? Our instructors have the right to teach how they want. That's academic freedom. And
Yeah.
we should be wary of framing a set of prescriptive actions that forces instructors all to do exactly the same thing. For instance, Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, it's all about optimizing choices for the learners. So it's doubly ironic to say you must when we're talking about the content, the knowledge, the skills in the
Mhm.
fields that we teach and the services that we provide. At the same time, we absolutely should say you must when it comes to making the systems predictable.
Right.
Same color schemes, layouts, button
Mhm.
styles, like in that University of Cincinnati example.
Mhm.
And your IT colleagues are your allies in this conversation. And when we're thinking about that, especially because sometimes colleagues can mistake consistent and predictable systems access or tool access, they can think that's an encroachment on academic freedom. It's totally not. It's important that we get support for those kinds of requirements from our administration, faculty senate, academic staff governance, the faculty union, our campus oversight bodies, shared governance in particular. That's got to come from the top down.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised how many people will get on board with this and how few people will raise a fist and say, you can't make me do that. I have academic freedom when it's just the way the system is designed. Oh, I have to
Right.
put alt text on all my images or it won't let me upload them. Okay, I guess I got to learn how to do alt text and off we
Right.
go.
And I would say too, one thing that we often fail to account for in terms of cognitive load of students is those things outside the technology outside of the classroom
Mm.
in their personal lives, right? They're all on social media of some sort, right? The Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, Discord, they're plugged in, they're getting notifications from all these places, they're connecting with people, on their phones, on their computers, all day long. That doesn't have to do anything with their academics. And maybe it does, at certain times, but we have to account for that as well. I think a little bit because in the past, you know, that wasn't a thing. Like students weren't connected 24/7 to other people, um, before we had all this additional technology. But now that's adding to their kind of cognitive load. And I think, and second part of that too is that the assumption that because they're connected to this technology in their personal lives, is the assumption that they are technology literate in all technologies.
Yeah.
Right? That just because they are young and they're plugged in, that they know how to use every technology that's out there. Um, and the reality is that they don't. They know how to use the ones that they know.
Yep. And
And yeah,
even then, like listeners, I'm going to tell you how old I am. I'm a white man with gray hair and glasses and a big gray beard, and I'm old enough that the generation before mine assumed that when I was 6 years old, I knew how to program a VCR to record programs and
yeah,
things, right? That was the
hmm
assumption of literacy. Just
right,
because the technology is there in your environment and
hmm
perhaps you're using it regularly means
right,
that you must have expertise with it. And that is
right,
absolutely never, ever, ever true for whatever generation and whatever technology we're talking about.
right,
There is a learning curve. It's kind of a
hmm
paradox in higher education. Our colleagues can expect, on the one hand, that students come into our spaces already having certain knowledge, skills, and experiences. That's that familiar litany of they should have learned that in high school, right?
yeah,
On the other hand, Paul Kirschner and Jaron van Merenboer argue in an article called Do Learners Really Know Best? Instructors today are expected to guide or frame the self-directed learning of their students. So I wrote down a quote from their article. They say, we observe the demotion of the teacher from someone whose job it was to combine their knowledge within a domain with their pedagogical content knowledge to teach those lacking this knowledge to someone whose role is now standing on the sidelines and guiding or coaxing a breed of self-educated learners. These self-educators can regulate and direct their own learning, seeking, finding, making use of all the information sources that are freely available to them. And that difference, the sage on the stage and then guide
hmm
on the side, that shift,
yeah,
they're kind of sad about that. That that guide on the side perspective means that we assume that students just know how to use the tools. Every
right,
librarian who's listening to the podcast now is going, we've been shouting this for decades, right?
yeah,
Just because students come to the library doesn't mean they know how to search for or
right,
find or assess the quality of information. And that's why librarians still
yeah,
have jobs.
yeah.
So it's weird. We
I,
can kind of,
I just want to interrupt real quick and tell a
yeah.
funny story. It's interesting because I walked into our library, recently, and I still have this memory in my head of, because I was an undergrad here at the University of Arizona, and I
Mm.
remember, stacks of books and everything, and now I walk into the library and the the books are gone, like not completely
They're
gone,
off
but
in the
it's
back corner
they're
somewhere.
they're
Yeah.
somewhere else, and it's just a lot of computers now. And I'm like, oh, well, where do I find the things that I need? Like, how do I look for it? But so yeah, even us old guys like have to adjust to
Where's
to
my
how things
physical
are,
media?
right? So sorry, it just that plugged into my head as you were talking
Oh
about
yeah.
libraries and librarians teaching people, and like, they have to teach
Well,
us
and
too.
yes, and it creates that paradox, right? We can
Yeah.
simultaneously perceive our learners to be both naive about the ways in
hmm
which learning happens effectively. So they're in need of structure and guidance from
hmm
instructors and support staffers in our institutions. And we can simultaneously think that they're sophisticated enough to understand and act on the hidden curriculum of strategies and practices that are underneath common academic tasks, like navigating which courses to take every term, or seeking assistance for academic and personal issues, or even just reading, studying, practicing, and preparing for activities in the formal curriculum. When we say, read this article, how many of our students actually know what we mean? The number of students in 1990, when students were surveyed and they said, how many whole books, entire books, have you read in the past year for pleasure? The average number was 4. In 2010, how many books have you read for pleasure? The average number was 1.2.
Wow.
And the latest data from 2020, just before the pandemic, how many books have you read for pleasure? 0.3.
Wow.
People are not on their own
hmm
seeking out long format media,
Right.
books, listening to audiobooks, whatever it is. And they've over time people have been consuming shorter and shorter things. They read an article or they watch a quick video, or
Yeah.
it's this little dip in, dip out kind of thing. And one of
Hmm.
the core skills that we want our learners to have is critical thinking and deep engagement with complex ideas, which
Yeah.
means you got to read a bunch and it's going to take a long time. So, we can see our learners as they don't know what they're doing, but then also, oh yeah, they've got to be expert at that. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's like a recent wrinkle that we can put in this conversation, and it's the debate about the amount of scaffolding, support, and training that's appropriate for college level learners. On the one hand, you've got people going, I had to suffer through that and slog through it, so it's going to be difficult for them too.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you've got folks saying, no, we've got to put as much scaffolding and support
Hmm.
as we can to just get the students through it. And one side's yelling at the other one, you're holding their hands and dumbing it down, and the
Hmm.
other side saying they won't understand it if we don't put the
Right.
supports. So one of the challenges, like the voices who are calling for increased rigor and the others who are advocating that variability among our learners is increasing along the lines of neurodiversity, socioeconomic background, cultural relevance, and more, this actually argues for greater flexibility as a rule to address like skill gaps and tech
Hmm.
training needs. We can apply that UDL, or Universal Design for Learning framework. That goal there is to produce agentic learners who are purposeful, reflective, resourceful, authentic, strategic, action oriented, all those good things. UDL allows us to start by welcoming learners from widely variable backgrounds, all their life circumstances, all their personal attributes, the great undifferentiated sea of a traditional freshman
Right.
class at many colleges and universities. And eventually, what we can do through design is give them all the skills, knowledge, and tools that they can use to move forward toward greater agency and self direction. But that has to be scaffolded. It has to have, hey, here's a skill
Mm.
that we want you to do, and here's actually how to do it. Here's pull back the curtain kind of stuff.
First of all, congrats for being the first to mention scaffolding in this episode of the podcast.
Yay.
Yeah, let's. We need like a fun sound effect for that when people do it. It's
Yeah.
been kind of one of our running you know
We can add it
segments
in
here.
post somewhere,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
of something where someone mentioned scaffolding. But yeah, we need something fun to alert people to it in the future. But you're right. Like that scaffolding um doesn't have to be so rigid. It just has to be structured for the students, right? And that ultimately will lead to greater student success as opposed to just the throw them in the deep end and hope they can swim approach. Which I'm sure there's still people out there that that do it, and that to each their own. But from a design perspective, from instructional designers, yeah, you bring up a lot of good points as to like how we can uh, you know kind of integrate these things and also teach and not necessarily hold. I think that the hold their hand phrase has that negative connotation. We're not holding their hand, we're guiding them through this path that they've never seen before, right? And so, much like if you're walking down, somewhere where you've never been, never seen, like, nowadays you can take out your phone and you have Google Maps and you can do it. Before you had to unfold a map and figure it out and know which direction and, put it on the ground and step inside and, look where you're going.
Mhm.
And so now, like, we are, as instructors, in some aspect, we are the Google Maps for our students. And so we need to kind of provide those steps for where they need to go and what they need to do. And how can we, if we want to introduce a new technology, how can we put it in there so that it's not just here's this new thing, figure it out, but here's this new thing, do these steps, learn about it. This is how you can apply it, not just in this class. And I think that's another thing too that, you know, we forget is that we're trying to prepare students not just to pass a class, but to be productive members of society, and digital literacy is part of that. So how do we show them also that this tool is beyond just getting a passing grade in this course, but to benefit you for your future as well. I don't know, I threw a lot out there, so feel free to comment on any part of that.
Is that the backward way of asking the AI question too? Because you
I
talked
mean,
about, hey, well, how do I pass this class? And
yeah,
the shortest way to do that is throw something into Claude or ChatGPT.
right. I mean, yeah, AI, plays a role. So we have limited time left here today to talk about it. So I don't know if we want to dive into that deep end. But sure, what role
Yeah.
does AI play in all of this? How can it help?
This actually might be a good way to wrap up our conversation because it takes some of the loose ends that we've put together
Hmm.
and actually gives us actions we can take, right?
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
Kirshner and Van Marienboer, they're right. It's an urban myth that learners all just show up magically capable and experienced in how to be self-directed learners and how to use technology tools. We can take a positive risk by implementing UDL and bring our learners along that path towards self-efficacy, toward what many of us call paraprofessionalism, where they eventually gain enough skills and subject knowledge that they can begin directing some and then almost all of their learning inquiries. But they definitely don't start there. I've put together a diagram that I call the crooked house chart to show what we can gain when we take the risk to design our services, our classrooms, our institutional engagements inclusively, balancing technology tool use against designed engagement and then later agentic engagement. Listeners, we're going to put a copy of this diagram
Yeah.
into the show notes, but
Yeah.
for now, imagine a chart where the horizontal axis goes from learner development from beginner through proficiency to practitioner level skills over time. So left to right. And then the box above the horizontal shows an inverse relationship between designed UDL and then technology tool use, like artificial intelligence tools. Designed UDL is the application of universal design principles by designers, instructors, and staff members in our everyday work. It's expert-led, it has tight boundaries, choices are largely constructed by the instructor or facilitator. So we have a lot of that when students are at the beginning of their learning process. And then over time, technology tool use, that includes affordances that allow learners to practice like flashcards and study guides, but also things that can do the work for the learners like generative large language models, what most of us think about when we say artificial intelligence or AI. So early in learners' experiences with new ideas or processes, their choices and options should be largely constructed for them by experts who facilitate their paths to basic mastery. This is learning things the long or hard or manual way first. As they start to get toward proficiency, we pare back those designed options to create space for both greater learner use of tool affordances. And then we add a rising triangle above that learner space, that rectangular space. So as learners move from beginners through proficiency and into expertise, we design for a concomitant rise in what I'm calling agentic UDL. So we turn the decision making gradually over to the learners themselves, where learners go above and beyond those limitations of the learning space in increasingly self-directed ways. So the crooked house diagram shows agentic UDL as literally above the space of our formally designed learning environments. So to maybe wrap up our conversation, when we design our spaces, our places, and our times in universally designed ways, we create contact points where beginners can find structure, where proficient learners can begin employing AI and tech tool based shortcuts and start branching out in directions that are intriguing to them. And then practitioner level learners find the fewest boundaries on their actions and the most complex use of tools to assist them. This is using AI to do the
Hmm.
beginning steps that they already know. So this process gradually shifts the risks, both negative and positive ones, from our institutions to the learners themselves, as it should be as they become more
Right.
professional. And this aligns with our missions as colleges and universities. We want our graduates to be well-prepared professionals,
Right.
ready to take on challenges in expert ways.
Yeah. And I think that does a great job of kind of, wrapping things up and bringing things together, because you're right. Like we want students to be in control of their learning, right? To a certain extent. Obviously, universities are saying like, oh, you have to take, these courses to get the degree, and there's these progressions, but at the same time, within those courses, like, grab a hold of what you want and how you want to do it, and move forward. And if designers can work with faculty to create those opportunities within courses, um, then I think you'll see some more powerful results. So, cool. Well, thank you, Tom, for joining us today. This was a very insightful conversation and fun, and I really enjoyed it. And we appreciate you taking some time and joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come on the show. Listeners, I'd love to hear from you. You can find out how to contact me. My website's just thomasjtobin.com. Adam, Brian, Futures in Digital Learning podcast. I hope that things continue to roll well for you. I hope we've given folks some food for thought, and I hope I'll see y'all on the road one of these days. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you. And listeners, we will be back with another episode in another month or so. So thank you all for listening.
The Futures of Digital Learning podcast is a production of the University of Arizona University Center for Assessment, Teaching, and Technology. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas you'd like to share with our office, go to the Contact Us link on our website, ucatt.arizona.edu.